My name is Mimi Healy. I work for the Costs of War Project. I'm a research assistant there, and I do a lot of like website assistance and copy editing and all kinds of various things. So the Costs of War Project, I don't know if any of you have heard of it before, but it is housed at Brown University at the Watson Institute, which is their school for international and public affairs. And the Cost of War Project is essentially a research project that works with scholars from all over the world to publish papers examining the various costs and ripple effects of the post 9/11 wars. So that was called like the Global War on Terror. That was coined by George Bush, after 9/11. And so the co-founders of Costs of War, one of them is an anthropologist named Catherine Lutz, and the other one is a political scientist named Nita Crawford. They were both professors at Brown, and in 2011, they really noticed that, 10 years after 9/11 and 10 years of being at war, um, through this war on terror, they noticed that, a lot of the approach to fighting that war and to spending money on that war and people's perceptions of just constantly being at war for the past 10 years was s- you know, really lacking. Like people either weren't talking very much about it or it felt like something that was just kind of happening in the background. So they developed the Cost of War project to really acknowledge all of the, horrible ways that war impacts people's lives. So that's looking at the economic costs. So like how much does the government spend? How much does it impact us through, taxes or through taking away money that could be spent otherwise? So the economic cost, we look at the human and social costs. So how does this impact people's lives? Everything from, you know, death and the loss of human life to um, if someone loses their house and their job through a bomb, and they're, a woman whose husband died and she doesn't have another option for work. What does she do with her life, or things like that. And then we look at the political cost. So how did the post 9/11 wars and our response to it as a country in the US and other responses, how has that changed politics? How has our political establishment really been molded through 20 plus years of war now? And and environmental cost. Nita Crawford, the political scientist that I mentioned, a lot of her work is around the environmental costs of war. So she actually recently wrote a book that looks at climate change in relation to the US military and war, because the US Department of Defense is actually the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, like the largest single institution emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. But, of course, like the government isn't usually talking about that, right? When we're talking about all the green initiatives that are happening, and it's always outside of like reining in our military and all the jet fuel that happen that just pollutes the earth, and also looking at environmental impacts such as um in Iraq and Afghanistan, places that have been heavily bombed, had these burn pits in the ground, um, have been contaminated in so many different ways. How does the environmental impact of war contribute to birth defects or unclean water, and what effect does that have? So the project really looks at like all of these various things, and the goal is really just to change, or not change as much as like encourage the narrative around these wars to really critically hold our government accountable, and to kind of through like an activist goal to really ask like, was this worth it? What came of these wars? How can we learn from this? And we're so fortunate to live in a country where we can hold our government accountable, and where we can question um, the the military and the government. There's so many countries where you'd be thrown in jail, or targeted heavily. So we really want to take advantage of that, and as citizens of this country to and as like just people with wanting a more peaceful and just world, how can we question everything that's happened since post 9/11? And I mean, since 9/11, how can we question the larger umbrella of everything that's happened and how that's affected us as a country? So, yeah, I mean, as a younger person, I guess now, something that really impacted me when learning about the work that Cost of War does is just how much of this has of being at war for over 20 years, in this war on terror since 2001, how much of that has really impacted like our lives and inequality in this country and elsewhere. So, I can like give you guys a bunch of statistics that we found. But I guess I just wanted to say that first off, because when you've been at war, or when you've lived in a country that's been at war for most of your life, or all of your life, probably in all of your cases, um, it becomes sort of background noise, and we don't take into account maybe the everyday reality that's happening on the ground in countries that we've invaded, or have provided, training and assistance to, and what exactly that really means. So that's something just personally, like when I learned about the project, I really became interested in that. I think of war as like this umbrella, and a lot of other um, ways that we see inequality, or, big issues like climate change, a lot of social justice issues, um, those all can kind of fall under the umbrella of war, in terms of like what lens you look at it through. So I guess with that being said, not only like questioning the narrative of war, right? Like how have you been taught about war? And as students, like what has your perspective on war been? Um, because I think it's kind of, like I said, easy to detach from that. But something that I really appreciate about the project is that it really grounds that in like our lived experience, and in learning the lived experience of people who have been impacted by these wars. So, I'll just kind of give you some statistics like off the bat. And one thing with statistics, right, is like we hear numbers all the time, especially with the internet. Like you're consuming data or visualizations or infographics all day long. And it's hard to make sense of these numbers. So that's something that, we're always kind of wanting to think about, like, how can we not just gloss over this and really take into account the destruction that's happened, and use that to hopefully create change. So, our research has found that that the post 9/11 wars have caused almost 1 million direct deaths. So that's death that has been caused by direct combat, by bombs, by airstrikes, by like direct targeted operations in war. But we had a paper come out last year that recently found that for every one direct death, there's about 3 to 4 times as many indirect deaths. And so an indirect death is the deaths that are caused by like ongoing ramifications of war. So if, hospitals have been targeted and there's no healthcare or infrastructure, houses are lost, or the water is contaminated and there's disease or there's lack of sanitation, all of these things can continue for years and years and years and generations. So we came out with a number last year that, given the direct and indirect deaths of post 9/11 wars, this could be at least 4.5 to 4.7 million people have died from these wars. And the war zones that we include in our research are Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting one. Yeah, I think those are Pakistan. Yeah, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya are like the main ones that have been the main countries that have felt probably some of the largest impacts. But now, I don't know if you all have like seen in the news or read about it in class or anything, but the US is really engaged with Africa. So, we would count like Somalia in a lot of those counts, in a lot of our research, because the US has conducted so many airstrikes targeting a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab in that country. So that's another, I guess that leads me to another thing. Like that is something that's really interesting about the war on terror, is that, the Twin Towers in New York were attacked by members of Al-Qaeda, and around 3,000 people died in the US. And so, uh, we invaded Afghanistan. Later in 2003, we invaded Iraq, and then have since conducted what is called a counter-terror, so like trying to fight terrorism. This idea of terrorism that really like sprung up more in 2001, it really became like so prominent. So we had a paper come out last year that found that we engage in counterterrorism operations in 78 countries. I guess one thing also that is really interesting economically is that our research has found that these wars have cost over $8 trillion. I wanted to show you guys like two really interesting resources that actually aren't through the Cost of War project, but that we have on our website under teaching resources. And you've maybe seen these before, but let me show you. So yeah, this ticker I find really interesting. So this shows the cost of national security and can show you some trade-offs. So cost of the war on terror since 2011, and this is, real time. We're seeing care for veterans of war. So there's thousands of US vets, right, who have fought in these wars, who will need a lot of them lifelong care for disabilities that they incurred during fighting for the US. There's interest, there's Homeland Security costs, State Department costs, military costs. And these are all, like, I guess through taxpayers, but something that I find, really interesting is how we can do some trade-offs. So this is where I think, as like younger people, myself included, I really think that it's like what emboldens me and makes me passionate about fighting for peace and in the anti-war movement is that this money that the US spends can be spent so much more effectively, right? Like we could literally have no student debt. We could essentially eradicate hunger in this country. We could put so much more money into aid abroad. We could, here we go. We could make so many trade-offs. And then the other one that I just wanted to show you quickly is this graphic is from a group that's worked with the Iraq body count. So they count all of the deaths, indirect and direct, that have occurred since 2003 to 2017. It starts like this. And essentially sorry, my dog is like chewing on a toy. Each red bar is showing a number of deaths. So the larger the bar, like this is 226 to 240 civilians killed, whereas like this one would be 10 civilian killed. And so this just continues and continues and continues. And I won't stay here the whole time, but you could essentially keep this going for almost an hour. And like this is really powerful, I think, and something that I like encourage you guys as people debating what to do, or maybe how to like make an impact, or how to work and make things engaging and really landing with people down the line in your careers or in your studies. Something like this I think is so engaging because it's not just a number, like you're seeing it happen, and you can feel like the horrendous like depths of the weight of this. So yeah, those are just two things I wanted to share with you. But yeah, I guess I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I don't know if anyone has any questions. I could keep going, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Question, just the station was a fact that people think about terrorists as like a group of people, but countries can be a terrorist too. Like I'm from Ukraine. I lived through a war. 10 years of my life was in a war. And if we speak about terrorists, we're speaking about Syria and also, but we don't speak about Russia. And there are big terrorists too. Many of my people died.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And right. I mean, it's so much of that is around the narrative that is told, right? Like whether it's the narrative around a nation and what creates a nation, or what the narrative is around defending a nation and land and a group of people. And then on top of that, what narrative is told around who is a terrorist or what makes up terrorism. And so much of that is like a politically expedient tool, right, to not only other a group of people, but to demonize and kind of create this like moral, I mean, it is moral to an extent, but right, like it's very black and white thinking. It's bad guys and it's good guys, and it's really hard to have room for nuance with a term like terrorism or terrorist. And it depends who's saying it for what reason, right? So the context is so important. Every war is not the same, every conflict is not the same. And even though we do look at the post 9/11 wars, each country, each year this has gone on has is situated within its own context and within its own history. And I think that's something that's so important. Like we must learn about history in order to not only learn from the past, but like not get caught up in these kind of like the tidal wave of, history. Like we have to find a way to critically think and move forward with knowledge from the past. And yeah, like imagining a different world where hopefully things can be more peaceful, more just, we can make these differences that matter so much.
How do you kind of avoid, and I'm talking about like you personally, and maybe you have advice for students with like tied to this, but how do you avoid being kind of desensitized to it? But at the same time, when you focus on this work, how do you also avoid not being like burned out while looking into like that window of suffering and, actually hearing the stories, seeing the faces, not just stats?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like there's not necessarily one way. I think like my boss and the team at Cost of War, we talk about this, like to, not be desensitized. I think it really takes just, like always respecting every life, right? Like having the dignity for every precious human life and keeping that in mind when looking at these numbers and hearing these stories. And, you know, that's something that like I always try and keep in mind. I think that's something that's so interesting with like whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the war between Israel and Gaza, things that are happening now in the news, we see so many statistics and it's almost like it almost seems like there's like a number that would be too much, right? Like it's like only some lives are horrible to have ended, right? It's always like women and children, but it's really remembering that like every life is precious and there's, one person killed is one too many. In my opinion. I mean, I would call myself a pacifist, so I'm just, non-violent. I'm in that camp. But in terms of, yeah, like not getting burnt out or like completely depressed all the time, I think that I personally just try and like hold a lot of gratitude. Like, for instance, I live in North Carolina and I'm like a white woman in the US who has never lived in a war zone. And I like have to keep that in perspective, right? Like as horrible as it is for me to read this every day and work in this, like it's hard to digest a lot of this material and empathize with it, but like I'm so grateful for my position and like I think like everyone in the world should know this information, right? Like I'm just like how are we still fighting wars, that are under the umbrella of the war on terror, but how are we bolstering foreign wars? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of other alternatives. I think there's so many questions that aren't asked. I think there's so many, ways looking back like that, at least with 9/11, I know like there's so many other alternatives that could have happened rather than invading a country, like the criminal justice system. I think with a lot of wars, that can be said. Like there's non-violent alternatives in the beginning that can be at least entertained and questioned and given thought rather than just like an immediate use of force. So that also I just keep in mind, like I just think this work is so important that I'm like, as hard as it is, we have to keep talking about this and changing the narrative around this.
So if we're talking about like the economical cost of war, especially with inflation involved, how would we actually be able to calculate like what America is spending their money on when it comes to war efforts?
Yeah, so the researchers who do a lot of that economic calculation are all economists, but a lot of the work is either looking at documents published by the Department of Defense. So a lot of the spending has to be made public. Um, so a lot of it is, like working on the internet, looking at databases that are published by the Department of Defense, Department of State, and then but there's also some spending that is like truly hasn't been tracked, and somehow it's been like we have so much money going towards the military that like things have literally gotten lost. Like we had a paper come out on Somalia, and the US, support economically to Somalia. And there's just like a lack of numbers and a lack of oversight. And that's why, the Pentagon goes through an audit every year and that's like to look at their financials and to look over kind of like everything administratively to make sure everything's, going correctly and like checks and balances. And they've failed that every single year, I think, since they've started, which I believe was like 8 years ago, less than 10 years ago. So they've never passed an audit. There's a ton of like fraud, abuse, waste that happens in war spending. And so that's a huge thing as well that like always has to be taken into account when we say, the number economically, like that is just the number that we have the data on and that we can confidently say, like, this is what we've found. And these are the sources, and this is why we came up with that number. But, you can't know what you don't know in terms of some of those numbers that have been lost to that waste, fraud, or abuse.
Can you
Yeah.
tell me some of your latest findings or anything that you guys had to adjust?
Some of our latest findings, one paper that I worked really closely on that I found really fascinating was around the Defend the Atlanta Forest movement in Atlanta. I don't know, in Georgia. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, but it's essentially a group of protesters who are like trying to defend this forest based in Atlanta that has been bought and kind of named Cop City. It's bought by the city of Atlanta and will benefit like police training. So it's essentially going to be like a 40-acre police training center where people from all over the country can come and get trained. And so, understandably, like cutting down 40 acres of forest is pretty horrible. And on top of that, like amidst the movements to defund the police and rising police violence, to have this like billions and billions of dollar training institute is really looked down upon. So there's been a lot of protests, and there's been someone died, and there's just been like nationwide calls to stop or block Cop City. And we did a paper that looked at the media response to that and really tried to hold the media accountable to the narratives that they were telling. And we found that, out of, I think we looked at 8 newspapers, only 2 of them really questioned the narrative of the government or the like authorities in Atlanta, and all the rest completely like demonized protesters. So that was really interesting because a lot of like, environmental protests have been like, I think now they call them like eco-terrorists, right? So like, how do we use the word terrorism? And now that word has been thrown around, or a lot of protesters have been like labeled domestic terrorists. It's a really scary finding to have like any sort of dissent to a movement or to funding or to a government, and how they can easily yield that term against you, even within the US. And another really interesting finding another interesting paper that we had come out recently was looking at like their surveillance system in the US. So not only like a surveillance camera like on the side of a building, but surveillance through our phones, surveillance through different like documents, anything online, and just how that's like ballooned and absolutely gotten huge since post 9/11. Obviously with like the rise in technology, that has gotten bigger since 2011 as well. But the way of surveilling not only like foreign, people trying to interact with people in the US or trying to enter the US, but even like citizens in the US, and, people of color, LGBTQIA plus, any sort of like left socialist, kind of like communist leaning, that is like completely targeted and really heavily surveilled within this country. So I think that's something that, is really scary to me, because we all have a phone, right? Like, or at least we know someone with a phone, or we get on the internet. And so that's a huge cost of war, is the surveillance that we have.
If I could give you a microphone to speak to like every high school student, whether they like history or not, what would be like a message that you could give them?
I would say, like we can really question the narratives that we're told. And I think that we can imagine a more peaceful and just world. And, we just have to work together to do that.
Thank you. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your questions. And thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
No problem. Thank you, Mimi. See ya.
Take care. Bye. Thanks.